This video will help you understand how to use 72T or substantially equal periodic payments as a way of getting money out of your retirement plan before 60. If you don't know who I am, my name is Chris Dime. I'm a certified financial planner out of Edmonds, Washington, and I specialize in working with folks to and through retirement. So we've all heard the conventional wisdom: save 10 to 20% of your income. First start with your company's retirement plan, like a 401k. And then once you've maxed that out, start saving into things like Roth IRAs. And obviously implied in there is to have an emergency fund, stay out of consumer debt, et cetera, et cetera. And one could make the argument that from a utilitarian perspective, AKA the greatest good, that this wisdom should stay the conventional wisdom. That is because for most people, doing something like this will help radically turn around their financial trajectory. And for most people, median income in the United States is 75 grand a year. If they save, 20% of their income, that doesn't reach the 401k contribution limits of, even for 2023, 22,500. So most people won't even get past, step one of saving, which is saving 20% of their income into a 401k and then needing to save elsewhere because they reach those limits. Unfortunately, if we dogmatically follow this guidance, it will leave us very susceptible to having an illiquid retirement income plan once somebody starts reaching the age of 60. And that's because the way that the IRS establishes retirement plan liquidations today is that if you look to take a withdrawal before the age of 60, technically 59 and a half, you will have to pay income taxes if the money was in a pre-tax account, and you'll have to pay a 10% early withdrawal penalty tax. So theoretically, if you're at the top marginal bracket in 2023 of 37%, you might be looking to pay somewhere in the ballpark of 47%, maybe a state income tax on top of that. So you might be looking to pay 50% in income taxes if you were to take money out of a retirement plan before 60. Now, you'll have to pay those income taxes either way, but the 10% penalty tax is ultimately what we're trying to avoid. And the 10% penalty tax is applied whether we're taking money out of a pre-tax account or a Roth account. So as clients get older and they approach age 60, if they are looking to unravel some funds out of the retirement plan, maybe early retirement, maybe job change, maybe starting that second career and they're kind of hurting for a little bit of an income stream at that point, if they're before the age of 60, they're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Do I liquidate retirement assets before 60 and pay a 10% penalty tax? Or do I forego pursuing whatever financial objective I was trying to pursue and hold off until I'm 60? Likewise, if the goal was some type of business venture, do we wait until 60 to start that business venture? Well, if you financially prepared ahead of time and you're 50 years old, that's a long time to wait before pursuing, your dreams and ultimately foregoing opportunity cost of that endeavor. All for the price of paying 10% in early withdrawal penalty taxes on whatever you withdraw. Now, there are some provisions that do permit an early withdrawal and that are exempt from that 10% penalty tax. These would be things like financial hardship, disability. There was even some COVID relief back in the day that had a factor in part of this. Education withdrawals, for example, those bypass the 10% penalty. There's specific rules for specific accounts, 401ks, IRAs, Roth IRAs, so you need to know the specifics on those. But for the most part, if you don't have any sort of emergency situation to where you need money out of a retirement plan before 60, odds are you will need to pay a 10% early withdrawal penalty tax. However, if you're not facing any sort of major financial emergencies, but you want to withdraw money out of your retirement account before the age of 60, there are some ways to get money out and bypass that 10% penalty tax. One of those ways is to use 72T or substantially equal periodic payments, SEPP. And in today's video, we'll break down how that works. So let's jump in. Simply put, the 72T provision of creating a series of substantially equal periodic payments permits any retirement account owner to start liquidating assets before the age of 60, avoid the 10% penalty tax, as long as you commit to that series of payments. You have to withdraw a certain amount of money every year for at least 5 years or until reaching the age of 59 and a half, whichever date is longer. Said another way, if you start your series of substantially equal periodic payments at the age of 40, you're on the hook for 20 years of pulling out a substantially equal periodic payment out of your retirement account. On the other hand, if you start your series when you are 58, you need to take out distributions for 5 years, so until you're 63. So even though you surpassed age 59 and a half during that series, you'd still have to continue making withdrawals for the next however many years equals a total of 5 years. So just to clarify, just because you attain age 59 and a half doesn't mean you get to stop taking out your series of payments. It depends how long ago you started them. Now there's 3 approved methods of calculating what is a substantially equal periodic payment. AKA, you don't just get to make up how much you want to take out. There is a formula to follow, and this is all found on the IRS website. Those 3 methods are the required minimum distribution method, or RMD method. The second option is the fixed amortization method, and the third option is the fixed annuitization method. So let's jump into each one of those. The first one, the required minimum distribution payment, I like to think about this one as the variable payment option, because in the other 2 options of taking out a series of equal periodic payments, your payment is going to be the exact same for however long that series is. Whereas with the required minimum distribution method, that payment is going to change every year. Annual payments using the RMD method are going to be found based on a calculation you'll run every single year. And the math is the same way that clients in their 70s, or for those who have inherited a retirement account and need to take out required minimum distributions, it's calculated the exact same way, where you take your account balance and you divide it by how long the IRS expects you to live. For example, a $500,000 account being withdrawn by someone that the IRS expects to live for another 30 years will be 500 grand divided by 30, and that equals around $16,600 for the first year. Now, the next year, that account balance, which was 500 grand, is going to be a different number. It could be less because you took out 16 grand plus, or it could be more because you still took out the 16 grand, but maybe market volatility gave you an additional boost in total value. So it's unclear exactly what your next year required minimum distribution will be. You can do some math and estimate an average rate of return, but it's always going to be wrong, but maybe it'll be a little more accurate than just shooting from the hip. In addition, the next year's calculation not only will use a different account balance, but it'll also use a different life expectancy, because according to the IRS, you no longer have 30 years to live, you have 29. But let's say theoretically, though your account balance dropped by 16K, and then it grew by 16K and it's back at 500 grand, that next year, since the RMD factor is a smaller number, your payment will be higher. It's probably best to run the trajectory of how long you'll need to be taking out your series of equal periodic payments via Excel. That way you can kind of get a barometer as to what to expect by way of income and income taxes and all that. The next method that the IRS allows you to use to calculate your series of equal periodic payments is to use the fixed amortization method. This one's a little bit more challenging to calculate, but it's not too dissimilar from running any sort of mortgage trajectory or running some sort of amortization on a property loan, for example. The fixed amortization method will give you a fixed series of periodic payments that you're on the hook for again, at least 5 years or until you reach 60, whichever one's later. And it's based on your account balance with some assumed interest rate, which we'll talk about in a second, as well as your life expectancy. So like a mortgage, using our previous example of a $500,000 account, you'd have a $500,000 mortgage, you assume an interest rate of 5% over the next 30 years, and that calculates to a payment. And you can use all sorts of online calculators to figure out what your payment is, which a lot of those calculators will abbreviate as PMT. But for this example, it's around $32,300 per year. And you will be required to pull that amount of money out of your account every year that you have this series of payments. Now, I told you we'd touch on the interest rate, and that's because the IRS has some qualifications for how to use an assumed interest rate when doing this amortization calculation. Specifically, the IRS says you can't use an assumed interest rate higher than either one of these two, either 5% or 120% of the federal midterm rate, which you can find on Google, but for 2023, here in September, 120% of the federal midterm rate is right around 5%. So for the most part, you're probably not going to be able to use any assumed interest rate higher than 5%. Now, a higher rate equals a higher payment. And this is intuitive because if you think about where mortgage rates are today here in September 2023, a lot higher than they were in 2019. And for the same $500,000 piece of property you might look to buy, your payment is going to be a lot higher this year than it would have been 3 or 4 years ago if you were to buy that same $500,000 piece of property. And we'll touch on why a higher payment may or may not be in your best interest, but just know there are some rules that you have to follow when using an assumed interest rate. The third method the IRS permits you to use when calculating a series of equal periodic payments is to use the fixed annuitization method. And again, just like the amortization method, this will also create a fixed payment schedule for however long your series of payments are. And this math is a lot more complicated than the first two, but we'll break it down. So first, you divide the account balance by an annuity factor. And the annuity factor is defined as the present value of a $1 annuity that is set to be paid to you for your life expectancy or your joint life expectancy if you're doing a joint calculation. And the interest rate that you use when doing the annuity calculation to find the present value has to follow those same guidelines outlined previously of no more than the larger of 5% or 120% of the federal midterm rate. Now, there's a little bit more nuance there, so if you are going to pursue this, you'd probably need to take a deeper dive, but high level, that's how the annuitization method does its calculation. And similar to the amortization method, you can find present value annuity calculators out there online for free. But just for example, if you took a $500,000 account balance, just like our previous two examples, and you use a 30-year 5% annuity of $1, that equals a present value of $15.37. So then what you do is you take the $500,000 account balance and you divide it by the annuity factor of $15.37. And that gets you a payment of around $32,530, which was pretty close to the amortization method, a little bit different, and it was very different than the required minimum distribution calculation. In fact, it was almost double the payment amount of the required minimum distribution calculation. So $1 million question, or $500,000 question in this example, is which strategy is best? Personally, I would put together an Excel spreadsheet that runs all three of these trajectories to see over the next at least 5 years, if not for however long I need the series of payments to go for. I would see what that does to impact the account balance of my portfolio, as well as I'd contrast that with my needs, right? If I need 10 grand a year, but my annuitization calculation is gonna force feed me 30 grand a year, well, that's 20 grand more a year that I don't need out of my retirement account. And once it's out of a retirement account, it's really hard to find ways to put it back in. And in fact, we'll touch on that in a quick second, but that's unnecessary income taxes I'm paying before the age of 60 on a retirement account, and I don't need the money. In addition, that money is now no longer compounding in a tax deferred environment. I'd have to find some other environment to put that in. And odds are, if I'm doing this, I don't have a tremendously robust number of different places to put away tax deferred money. And the earlier you start this series of payments, the higher the likelihood is that during that series, you're gonna suffer some downturns in the market. Because while it might be all well and dandy that when my portfolio is growing at 10% and I'm taking a 1 or 2% distribution, if my account balance drops and I have to take out the same amount of money out of my portfolio, that's a much higher percentage of total distribution I'm taking from the account. And again, I can't put it back in, and that money is permanently gone out of my account. But I still get to pay all the same income taxes, which maybe goes without saying, but market volatility and specifically market severe downfalls don't stop your series of equal periodic payments. You have to continue them. Now, there's one caveat. If the series of equal periodic payments completely decimates your account and it goes down to zero, then you're allowed not to take out the full amount that you promised you would because you don't have any more money. But that is something to consider when choosing which method you want to use for your calculation, because indirectly, a market downturn would affect the required minimum distribution calculation method. But that method doesn't necessarily yield the same amount of income coming out of your portfolio. Now, there are a few onesie-twosie rules that the IRS outlines that I want to cover here in our video today. And the first one is that the IRS does permit you to make a one-time change from either the annuitization or amortization method to the required minimum distribution method. Once you make that change, it's permanent, and in the year that you make that change, that's when you start using the required minimum distribution method of calculation, and you have to continue the RMD method until you're done with your series. Now, we talked about this earlier, but I would see that as very valuable if the market has a severe downturn, is making that switch before you do all your math and you take out your distribution, because a market downturn is less affected by a required minimum distribution calculation. You're using that new annual account balance every year to make your math happen, rather than the other methods, which you're locked in at a particular payment, which again, if the markets go down, you're taking out a much higher percentage of the total portfolio, assuming you take out the same amount, but the account balance went down. I guess just to make this very clear, the life expectancy is not your personal opinion. The IRS pushes out very specific tables based on which method you use. So if you are going to pursue this option, I'd speak with a qualified tax professional to help guide you to the right tables to be using relative to your life expectancy. If you're going to do something like this from like a 401k, for example, you will need to have separated from service. So you can't do this with existing retirement accounts with your current employer. Now, if you have an IRA and you want to do something like this with, that's fine because IRAs aren't attached to an employer. You could do this from an IRA while you're working. The last two are pretty important, so let's touch on those. Number one, once you start doing your series, you cannot take any additional ad hoc distributions, nor can you make contributions to the account. So even if you pass the age of 60, and theoretically you'd be able to take out as much as you want out of this without any sort of tax penalties, if you're on a series of equal periodic payments, you're not allowed to take out any more than your series dictates. Until your series is complete, you're locked in. You can't put any more in, you can't take any more out. And the last point is on whether or not you can have multiple series of equal periodic payments. And the answer to that's yes, but not out of the same account. So theoretically, if you had a 401k and an IRA, and you were no longer employed at that company's 401k, and you started your series out of your IRA, you could set up a new series out of your 401k. You'd have to continue the IRA one, of course, but you could set up the new 401k series as well and maybe use a different method, and maybe it's a different account balance, so the math is totally different. So wink, wink, if you're planning to do this, might make sense to break up your IRA into a number of different IRAs if you want to have a smaller payment using one of these methods. That could be a factor in your planning. Now, relative to stopping payments out of the series, like I mentioned, this is only a factor if your account balance goes to zero, or of course, via death or disability or something like that. There are some qualifications for specific public sector employees, but that's kind of beyond the scope of today's video. This applies to 90% of people. I think the 72T or substantially equal periodic payment distribution methods could make a lot of sense if you wake up in your 40s and 50s and realize either you want to retire early and you're willing to commit to a schedule, or you wake up and realize, hey, like I don't have any other liquid investment assets to pull from, so I'm willing to commit to a payment plan or a schedule of withdrawals. In a perfect world, if we can forecast well ahead of time that you will be retiring before the age of 60, in my opinion, there's some more effective methods of building up assets to pull income from. Things like brokerage accounts, even the basis out of your Roth IRA is something you could pull from without taxes. You could also look into setting up things like life insurance plans if you structure them appropriately. So those are beyond the scope of today's video, but I think at the end of the day, it's a helpful parachute, 72T, SEPP, if you wake up and realize you need some money. Just plan accordingly because there's a bit of math involved, and I would hate to see you end up needing to speak with the IRS and pay some tax penalties because you did some incorrect math. So calls to action, I would look at your retirement income plan, and if you identify that, hey, we are going to be flush with total assets before age 59 and a half, could we factor in some type of 72T or SEPP distribution schedule to sort of bridge that gap between when we retire to when we otherwise would be qualified to take money out of our retirement plans without a tax penalty? Speak with a tax professional, speak with your financial planner for some specifics. Hopefully that was helpful. Have an awesome rest of your week. And if you need anything, feel free to get in touch via the website or in the comments below. Have a good one. Talk to you later. Bye.